Welcome back to Capital and Country. It's the King's birthday long weekend, or it was previously, depends on when you're listening to this. I had a chance to get out of the city and head back down the south coast with one of my closest mates who has recently moved from New Zealand. And over time, he showed a real interest in learning about my culture and heritage. And I must say, it's really nice and it's really meaningful. And so to head back down there with him was a very special opportunity with lots of laughs and lots of fun. Bit of context, I'm a Walbunja man. My family songlines traverse the Shoalhaven River right on the border of Yuin and Tharawal Country. I was born on that river and I'm a saltwater man, and every time I go back down there, especially when I get in the water, it's always a special opportunity for me. For our trip, we spent part of our time at Bundanon, a former home of Arthur and Yvonne Boyd, which is now an art museum open to the public. And when I say that this architecture is so beautifully and respectful to the landscape and how it folds into it, honestly, words can hardly describe how well kept and how thoughtful towards the land Bundanon is. And I think walking through the galleries overlooking the land and the river, I thought a lot about how art and the place can speak to one another and complement one another. It reminded me of the quiet power of a story, not just the kind you tell, but the kind that you inherit. We also visited the Maritime Museum in Huskisson. I came across a pair of Arnie Esme Timbery's shell shoes. Say that 5 times. Jesus Christ, shell shoes, shell shoes. So my late nan, Mari Stewart, an elder from down the south coast, used to make the same kind of shell work. I vividly remember going to the beach with her and we would go looking for pippies, but she would always continue to sort of walk around and pick little shells up off the beach. And again, I think a kind of a full circle moment is I guess the first major piece of sort of work publicly that I did for the Indigenous Business Review magazine centered around the idea of Aboriginal people exporting goods and opening up globalization to First Nations goods and services. And I used the analogy of my nan's shoes and sitting on different mantles across the world. And so seeing that in the museum, Barney Timbery's shoes just kind of took me back to watching her, collect these shells thoughtfully, put effort and thought and culture and love into creating these shoes. And so, yeah, not seeing them in person for quite a while sort of brought me back to memories I haven't thought about. And it reminded me that even in tough times, in struggles, our culture, which is the oldest living culture, has survived through hands, through detail, through care. And as I turned the corner in the museum, I was confronted by something completely opposite to that and an opposite feeling. And I saw a certificate of exemption, and they're colloquially known as dog tags. They were issued to Aboriginal people who applied for exemption from the State's Protection Act. And on paper, it granted some basic freedoms. And I think that, a lot of people, including myself, admittedly including myself, don't know what it's like to not have certain rights, especially even through legislation, that, it was deemed that you couldn't live off the mission, that you couldn't own property, that you couldn't go to school. And so to see that someone had applied and was accepted basically an exemption certificate to give them the right to be able to do things like access services and live off the mission. But what that meant was that they were disconnected from the community, culture, and family. And I think that a lot of people underestimate how difficult that would be for yourself, but also for Aboriginal people that are connected so much to the land, the community, traditions, how much of a difficult decision that was, and also potentially some of the lateral violence that comes with applying for an exemption certificate. You're never going to fully be accepted in this white world, but you're also probably not going to be looked fondly upon from your own community after that. So it really truly was a bit of a lose-lose situation. But yeah, I think just seeing one of those in person was quite a gut punch. Yeah. So look, on that note, the trip was only a few days. It was so nice to get back down there. It was a shame that I didn't get to get into the ocean, but I got to share my country with someone who cared to listen. And in doing so, I reconnected with parts of myself. And I'm still learning and still uncovering stories and still learning about the layers of our history as Aboriginal people. I think that that's all we can ask for. I think that, If anyone's out there listening, whether you are Aboriginal or not, we all do have a history, and don't let anyone tell you that you don't have a right to learn that history or you're less than if you don't know everything in such detail as other people. We're all on our own journey of figuring out who we are in this world. And so I'd suggest that, yeah, you just try and reconnect and you really just lean in. And so, there is something quite powerful about returning to the places that shaped you. So while I was down there were big things happening here in New South Wales. From Eden to Moree, from kitchen tables to correctional centres, we're finally asking the long overdue question of, do we want a treaty? After decades of delay, New South Wales is the last mainland state to formally begin consultation with Aboriginal communities about what a treaty of any kind of formal agreement making might look like. 3 commissioners, including Wiradjuri and Gomeroi man Dr. Todd Fernando, have been appointed to lead the process. The plan? 27 regional hubs and more than 50 additional sessions over the next year. For the first time, the question of what kind of relationship First Nations people wants with the state and how that relationship is structured is being asked, not answered on our behalf. But not everyone is convinced. In Moree, Gamilaroi elder Uncle Lyle Munro Jr. says no one has come to speak with his community. He questions the legitimacy of the appointees and fears that Aboriginal voices, as always, will be sidelined. Non-Indigenous people will control the debate, he says. Eden-based Yuin elder Uncle BJ Cruz supports localised treaties based on land council and native title boundaries. But he also warns, without protection, any agreement could be undone by future governments. What's offered must be underwritten, he says, and shielded from political whim. Commissioner Fernando is blunt. This isn't a talk fest. This consultation will not be safe for the status quo. For him, treaty is not about the past. We're not building a treaty for 1788. We're building a treaty for the future. With other states scrapping or stalling their process, New South Wales' approach may set a new national tone, one rooted not in symbols, but in sovereignty, responsibility, and reckoning long deferred. Me personally, I'd love to be part of the consultation process and support in any way I can. So anybody who's currently involved, hit me up. I'd love to lean in and help. I think for me, a treaty, each state has its own constitution. I'm unsure the mechanisms required to amend the constitution at a state level, but we could potentially look at implanting a treaty or some language in there that supports a treaty in the constitution if we're so concerned about legislative whims. But I think for me, I sit on the other side of the fence in this argument. I think we should be a part of the consultation. We should have our voices heard. We should be at the table, but we just got to keep trying. We got to keep throwing things at the wall and just see what sticks and what actually supports us. At the end of the day, if it's iterative, if we have to continue doing this, there's enough people out there that are willing to fight the good fight to continue progressing the rights, the liberties, the comfort, the restoration and keepings of traditions that I'm sure that legislative amendments or, executive policy is not ideal, but we just got to try. We've got to do something. So I'm fine with it being legislated. I think if we just get the ball rolling and keep the government accountable for what they legislate, regardless of who is in Parliament at that time, at a New South Wales level, I'd love to be a part of the consultation and see what comes out from the consultation. Moving on, 3 First Nation visions go to camera in South Australia. I found this one really interesting. I'm currently writing my own, or trying to write my own screenplay, but I think in an era where Black storytelling often fights for funding, 3 bold First Nations short films are now in production in South Australia, and this time they are backed by real investment. And this is awesome. I think that, you look at some of the stuff that's going on in other countries. You take Ryan Kluger's Sinners, which is his first original screenplay. That was amazing. Obviously, he had to work up to that. He, did Creed, Black Panther. It's not original screenplay, but clearly he proved himself enough as a director to be funded for an original screenplay. But, when you tell these interesting racial, social, historical stories in unique POVs. And I was talking to my partner recently about this, and sort of a little exercise is You think about a story that's vivid to you that's happened to you. You talk about it in detail, who was there, what happened, how did it make people feel, all these types of things. And then you choose someone else or something else and you retell the story in their POV. A prime example could be, let's take my nan, for example, who made her shoes and she sold it to a little kid at a market. What's the shoes POV? And what story can you tell through the shoe or the little girl? God, the hermit crab that lived inside the shell before it was picked up from the beach. So anyway, I digress, but I'm really excited about this. The South Australian Film Corporation has funded, through the First Nations short film program, Digital Abyss, The Secret, and Catchin' Mumu, a powerful moment in Black cinema. Each script was developed through intensive mentoring and workshops last year, and the filmmakers Josh Barbo, Lilia Berry, and Dylan Coleman are behind the camera with $45,000 in production support each. Their stories cut across genre and emotional terrain. In Catching Mumu, a young boy rows out to confront a great white shark that's been stealing his father's catch, a collision of traditional survival and cinematic suspense. Digital Abyss blurs the supernatural with grief as a mother haunted by late-night phone calls from her deceased son spiral towards something darker. And The Secret offers an unflinching portrayal of a woman's silent struggle with at-home abortion. Each writer-director brings a distinct voice, from Dylan Coleman's award-winning collaborations and academic work in Indigenous health, with Barbo's Wajuk Noongar lens on psychological loss, to Berry's emergence as a formidable new voice in narrative film, adapting everything from horror to Winton. More than creative expression, these films are career springboards. As SAEFC CEO Kate Croser noted, short films are the most important thing for filmmakers to gain real credits and build a pathway in the industry. Cost of living crisis opens the political space for First Nations housing push. Paul Coe, CEO of Birraby Housing, sees opportunity in the cost of living crisis. As housing pressures hit more Australians, long ignored Aboriginal concerns are finally on the national agenda. Society is now saying this is an election issue, Coe told The Point. It's a sweet spot for Aboriginal people to push. Birraby, launched by New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council in 2019, manages hundreds of homes across New South Wales, including over 120 in Blacktown, home to the largest urban Indigenous population. But Coe says the situation is urgent. Old cottages barely standing up, somehow society accepts that. Beyond supply, he argues, the real housing crisis is structurally rooted in institutional trauma and invisible homelessness, masked by kinship care. We hide that homelessness, but it creates pressure points across households, schools and services. With 60,000 on New South Wales public housing waitlist, demand is high, but Darug elder Uncle Chris Tobin warns must not come at the expense of country. Where the country's healthy, we'll be healthy. For Coe, the challenge is long-term vision. 3 or 4 year political cycles won't fix this. We need sustained focus, housing that heals, land that lasts. So I think with this, we've discussed previously on the podcast around my wish list for Labor, particularly in housing. I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. I think, again, speaking of treaties, speaking of just consultation and setting up, potentially a sort of voice to parliament light for New South Wales, these are the types of situations where we need a voice, a channel to go and have these conversations at a state-based level or at a local level to talk about how we are going to set us up for success in terms of housing. Having a house that's hardly standing up, is that appropriate? Is there a duty of care from the state or the council to make sure that they're viable houses? If they are, why aren't we asking that? Why aren't we pushing for it? Why aren't we advocating? Moving on to, I think it's worth mentioning a bit of a trigger warning here. I will be talking about an elder that has passed away. The remote community of Wadeye is in mourning after the death of a senior elder, a respected leader, educator, and traditional owner. He died in intensive care unit of Royal Darwin Hospital after being taken into police custody on May 30th. Tien was detained by the Australian Federal Police at Darwin Airport under protective custody laws. Police alleged he was attempting to board a flight while intoxicated. He was taken to hospital for monitoring, where he suffered a serious medical episode and never recovered. His death has sparked an official investigation and renewed pain in communities still grieving another recent death in custody. Northern Territory opposition leader Selwyn Ubu called the loss beyond tragic and said Tian was a strong and respected leader. For those who knew him, Tian was far more than a headline. He was a co-principal, a mentor, a campaigner for a better future. Catholic Bishop Charles Gauchi described walking beside Tian's family in his final hours. He believed in education as empowerment, Gauchi said. He leaves a big gap. Tian helped shape the Tharawal Development Corporation and played a guiding role in its growth. He fought for two-way learning, grounded in culture but open to the modern world. His death in custody demands reflection on the systems that failed him, on the urgency of reform, on the dignity that remains even in grief. As it gathers to remember, the Northern Territory must reckon with the loss not just of a man, but a visionary who deserved to grow old in his community, not be farewelled in a hospital ward under police supervision. Sydney's stretch rap. I live in the city of Sydney, and I welcome the ambition in its new Stretch Reconciliation Action Plan. It shows real intent, but I've also seen how raps can become glossy brochures, full of good feelings and light on result. Reconciliation is not about paperwork, it's about outcomes, and that is where we change lives. For me, thinking about raps, I could not tell you when I engage with a service, a product, a company, the government, the council, like I don't, as an Aboriginal person, I never look up to see, well, what's their rap like and how, what are they trying to achieve and how beneficial is it? But I could point to you and distinctly tell you where I've had good outcomes and where I've had bad outcomes. So, a prime example, UNSW, sitting on campus right now recording this podcast because they understand the importance of me expressing myself and my culture, and I get access to a podcast room. I can point, mind you, I've also got a postgraduate degree and I'm currently doing my second postgraduate degree here. I've lived on campus. I play rugby for them. I can point and say that I've had amazing outcomes here at UNSW. I couldn't tell you what's in their rap. I couldn't tell you how many objectives they've got. I couldn't even tell you if it was a stretch wrap, an elevate wrap, a chicken shawarma wrap. I couldn't tell you. So look, I don't really care about wraps, but like I said, I'm all for and welcome the ambition. The city has a new 3-year plan developed with its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory panel. It outlines the steps to deepen relationships, grow cultural understanding, and strengthen economic opportunity, which I'm particularly interested in and a big advocate for. It includes targets to increase Indigenous employment and procurement, and it speaks to shared ownership. The Gomeroi woman, Tonya Pinner, who co-chairs the advisory panel, says this plan is about walking the talk, means supporting community-led organisations, creating culturally safe workplaces, and embedding First Nation voices in decisions that shape this city. It's about listening more and making sure Aboriginal voices are not just heard but valued. And that's great. I'm all for it. I'm very supportive of all this. And I would love to spend some time not being presented a shiny, glossy reconciliation action plan, but be talked through it, to be shared through story and insight. Just ironic that we talk about sort of preserving tradition and culture, and the way that we try to explain how we're going to do that is by pumping out a 50-page, white fella document. So yeah, would be really good to kind of spend some time with, say, the Lord Mayor Clover Moore to understand a bit better on. It has been praised. So Reconciliation Australia's CEO Karen Mundine has praised the city for doubling its procurement spend with Aboriginal businesses and for focusing on self-determination. And Lord Mayor Clover Moore said Sydney must lead, that leadership will be judged not by promises but the experiences of First Nations people living and working here. And I couldn't agree more. I think, like I said, I could point to you and tell you when I've had a good experience as an Aboriginal person. I couldn't tell you who had a rap, what level it was, what objectives there were. And so I think that, there's just kind of this disconnect between, great, they've got a reconciliation action plan and it's a stretch reconciliation action plan. But on the other side of it is, great, so what does that actually mean and where do we see sort of tangible results from that? And that's a wrap for this episode of Capital and Country. Thanks for hanging out with me. I really appreciate you being here. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to send it to a mate or just let me know what stood out to you. There's always more to explore, more to learn, and more to say. So I'll be back soon with some more stories. Until then, take care of yourself and each other. I'm Harry Stewart. Catch you next time.